Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming tonight. We're grateful to you for joining us here and for being part of our community. My name is Elric Walker. I'm a board member of the Jung Association of Western Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Jung Association of Western Massachusetts. We are an all-volunteer organization founded in 1996. Concerned with promoting and exploring in community with others the ideas of the great depth psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. As an all-volunteer organization, we very much rely on you as part of our community and in the spirit of volunteering to help us to meet our financial obligations in bringing you this monthly lecture series. So please consider making a donation tonight to help us to cover our costs. We suggest a $10 donation if you're able, but anything above or below that will be very helpful and very much appreciated. Now, how do you do this? Where do you do this? If you go to the chat, you will see a link in the chat to make a donation. And I would suggest that now would be a really good time, perhaps, to do that as I continue with the announcements. I want to emphasize again how important this is because we often wind up in deficit at the end of a season. And so it's very important that if you can make a donation, that you do so tonight. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce you to our board members and to thank them for their work on behalf of the association. The president of our association is Erica Lorenz. Christine Olson is our secretary. Mark Iwanicki is our marketing strategist. Penny Tarasuk is advisor to the board. Ed Tick is also advisor to the board and our program director. Judy Hall is our bookkeeper. And it is my honor to work on public relations on behalf of the association. Many kind thanks to Andy, who's here tonight providing Zoom and technical assistance. Thank you, Andy. Andy has generously helped us through this long COVID season, which hopefully is going to end soon, who knows. But thank you, Andy, for all your help and assistance. Next month's lecture, and this will be the last lecture of our series. There has been a schedule change. I just want you to make note of this. Next month's lecture will be on Friday, May 13th at 7 p.m. And we will have a very special speaker that night. You may have heard of him before. His name is Thomas Moore. And Thomas has written a number of books dealing with the human soul. Perhaps his most famous was a book called Care of the Soul. He is a very wise elder of the community and a profound speaker. His presentation will be a therapeutic way of life. So once again, that's going to be on May 13th. Please join us for that. Also, please visit our website for our lecture, our full lecture schedules and any upcoming events. We also have an archive on the website where you can visit past lectures and other related events that are archived there on video. The website address is westmassjung.org. westmassjung.org. All right, I'm going to turn things over now to Ed Tick, who will present tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, all, and thank you, Elric, very much for welcoming us, and Andy for your service to us. Good evening, friends. I'm Dr. Ed Tick. I am a board member and lecturer of our association. And like Elric and all of us, we welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight and for your concern and devotion for these deep issues that we explore together. And also, like Elric, I do request that you make any donation of any size that you can to help keep these events going. And well, to keep us all going, we all need our oats just to survive, especially these days. So this evening, I am very pleased and proud to introduce tonight's speaker, my friend and colleague, Dr. Penelope Tarasuk. Penny is a Jungian analyst in private practice here in the Valley. She works with individuals, couples, and families, and not just Jungian analysis, but please be aware, Penny has over 50 years of experience in the mental health field in numerous with numerous foci and demographics that I'll explain in a moment. Penny is the author of a book called Polishing the Bones. If you would like a really good taste of what a deep, long, complex analysis is like for both client and therapist, leading to wonderful healing and creative unfolding, I highly recommend Penny's book, Polishing the Bones. Penny's a senior training analyst and on the faculty of the Northeast Society of Jung Analysts and the Boston Jung Institute. And not only is she in that honorific position, but she was also one of the very first graduates of the Institute. And she's been involved in its evolution and development for over 40 years. Penny's education and experience began long before any formal training, and she's really continued it through the whole life cycle. She grew up loving and drenching in Jungian psychology, philosophy, the arts, animals, nature, and these have guided and sustained her in her practice and in her entire life. Through her career, she's worked with some of our most challenged populations in the most difficult social settings. She guides people gently and beautifully and deeply to wholeness. So she's worked with inpatient mental health, with drug abuse victims and survivors, in suicide prevention, with at-risk adolescents, and with traumatized animals. She doesn't only help the two-leggeds, she helps everyone. She's been a devoted and hardworking lecturer and board member of this association for many years. Penny loves this path to wholeness and creativity and integrity, and she loves to share it with her clients and our community. And she doesn't only work in the Jungian tradition, she is an artist. She moves beyond just what we think of as psychology into artwork, spirituality, dream work, breath work. And tonight she has been exploring non-normative states of consciousness, all forms of flow. And tonight she's going to lead us in an exploration of these states and how they can contribute to our achieving wholeness and healing and spiritual evolution. So with great gratitude and respect and honor, I welcome you and present to you Penelope Tarasuk.
Thank you. I noticed there are many of my wonderful friends and colleagues in the audience, and I'm very moved. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, board. And I think I would like to start with a short sound meditation honoring the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, and take a moment to allow all of those souls coming and going into our hearts. And I am half Ukrainian, so I'm really, there's no way I can't be feeling this simultaneously. So please, with me, just for a moment or two. Thank you. So tonight I'm coming out of the closet. Actually, I'm going to be talking about a little bit about Jung and psychedelics. And I'm going to be talking about the California Integral Institute of Psychology's certification in psychedelic assisted therapy. So I'm going to do that in a kind of logical, linear language way. And then I'm going to shift and I'm going to present some less linear, more art, meditative, and a story. And I'm going to tell you the story of how I came into doing all this work. And I've been working in the realm of Jung since I was about 4 years old. So I will tell you about that. And I feel it's very important to emphasize to you that so much of this work in the new psychedelic medicine field requires a tremendous amount of preparation on the part of the therapist, but on the part of the participants who eventually do experience the medicines. And I want to emphasize the necessity for great preparation. And there's the experience perhaps, but the integration phase is so crucial. I cannot say enough about this. And I'm a living example of spending 50 years still integrating one of the most profound experiences I ever had in my life. So I want to say to you, I want to slow it all down and say, all of this takes tremendous preparation, attention, and part of what we'll talk about tonight is non-ordinary states of awareness, non-ordinary states of consciousness, which we're all doing a lot of the time. So we're all in preparation anyway. And I want to give that more attention. And I'm going to use my art to tell you about my journey. I don't normally show my art to many people. And I think it's very important that you know that art is one of the ways of integrating all this material, whether or not there's medicine involved, but dreams, etc. And I would say art and nature helped save my life. And I mean that quite seriously. And it's also, there's a great joy in it as well. So I'm going to share art in the latter part of this. And I know you might have many questions, and I don't know if we're really going to have time for discussions, but I'm going to present a lot. And I want you to know I will go on and keep teaching about this in the fall. But this is a first go at all this material together. So bear with me. It's a lot. I threw out about 6 slides already. And I just want to do justice to the material. And I'm delighted to have you all here tonight. Ada, I saw you come, so thank you for attending too. So let's see. I guess I could come to my Zoom presentation now. Andy, are we ready?
Yes, just remember to check the sound box.
Yep, it's on. So, okay. Okay, I'm gonna go back some. Okay, I'm not going to talk very long about Jungian psychedelics because actually Jung never really wrote about psychedelics. There's some commentary from him, but not much at all. So I want you to know there isn't a place where Jung really discussed psychedelics. But I found Scott Hill's book, which is Confrontation with the Unconscious, Jungian Depth Psychology and Psychedelic Experience. Scott Hill is a psychologist who got his Ph.D. at CIIS, And he did an incredible review of Jung's work and wrote a beautiful book about this material. And I also made a bibliography for you, which Andy will put in the chat. So there's a number of books you might want to look at, read, prepare, and think about. But Scott Hill did the homework for us and pulled out a lot of material from Jung's work. So in a very pithy way, what I want to say is Jung's criticism, this is from Scott Hill, Jung's criticism of psychedelic enhanced psychotherapy is based on his belief that it is impossible to integrate the unconscious content released by psychedelic substances. As Scott Hill, will demonstrate in later chapters, Jung's idea of integration is central to his psychology, and it is an essential element in individuation. Integration, from Jung's perspective, can be understood for now as bringing released unconscious material into a conscious relationship with consciousness. This process moves the person toward a balanced relationship between consciousness and unconsciousness, toward, that is, psychological wholeness or individuation. To fully understand Jung's criticism of psychedelic enhanced therapy, we need to appreciate his concern for the integrity of the psyche's conscious aspect. He is acutely concerned with the dangerous consequences of neglecting the unconscious. For Jung, integration can only occur when the consciousness is stable enough to assimilate the material that arises from the unconscious. So part of Jung's concern was, who takes this medicine? How well prepared are they? Do they have a strong enough ego to even begin to do this work? And in medicine work and in the research studies, people are always screened deeply prior to being admitted into a research study. And I would imagine going forward, when these medicines are legal, and I want to say very clearly, the only really legal psychedelic, if you want to call it that, is ketamine, and that can be prescribed by a psychiatrist. But the medicine of MDMA is still in the third trials of research, and we hope that it will be passed into legality by the FDA, possibly in 2023. And psilocybin, there's many studies done and ongoing with psilocybin, and that will probably come later. So just know these and LSD are really not legally permissible medicines at this time. So neither I nor other people are doing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in the public realm these days. So I wanted to say that. One of the things we're all concerned about is the ethical use of medicines and the ethical behavior of the psychotherapists that are eventually going to be able to use these medicines. I'm in the 2021 cohort of the program, CIIS program, and I won't be finished until June. I finished the work, but I won't be certified until June. So I wanted to make that clear. So Scott does a tremendous amount of work talking about Jung and the transcendent function and the analytic experience. And by the time he gets to the end of his long study, this is kind of the pith of what he found. Perhaps this investigation's most important implication is that Jung's methods of integration provide a uniquely nuanced and thorough way to integrate psychedelic experiences. And the several therapists that were involved with LSD use have shown that Jung's methods can be used at suitable times by skilled therapists to encourage patients to integrate unconscious images and emotions during psychedelic sessions. They work with not microdosing, but very low doses, psycholytic use of LSD back in the 50s and the early 60s. And they were in England. And Scott goes on to say, over the course of this investigation, I have developed a greater respect for Jung's warning about the dangers inherent in psychedelic experience. My attitude toward Jung's criticism of psychedelic psychotherapy softened when I realized that his concern for its risks and reflected his concerns for the risks of psychotherapy in general. In other words, Jung was concerned when people start stirring up the depth of the unconscious, they often don't realize how powerful it is. And if you add a psychedelic medicine, you're really entering very profound material and realms of the psyche. That is, I realized Jung's cautiousness wasn't simply a prejudiced reaction to a practice he didn't understand. And I took time to reach out to Scott Hill, and we spent a couple of hours talking. He was in Sweden, and he talked about a very early childhood trauma experience of his own and a very negative LSD experience that he had. He writes about this in his book. And I think he really, unfortunately, didn't have the help of a well-trained guide with him, but he certainly has done the work of bringing this forward for us. So as I was looking around, I found something very interesting that I didn't know about, which was Edward Edinger, a New York analyst, a very famous New York analyst, who wrote a wonderful book called The Anatomy of the Psyche, an alchemical symbolism in psychotherapy, and that was from 1985. And in the alchemical process of the sublimatio, which deals with an ascent that raises us above the confining entanglements of immediate earthy existence and its concrete personal particulars. In Jung, the sublimatio is part of the royal road, the royal art of alchemy, where the true gold is made. And a patient of Edinger's brought him her visions from her LSD experience. And part of what Edinger said was that the revelation in LSD and in various visions of somebody named Priestley who had amazing dreams, and in the poetry of some people, that it indicates such experiences have objective validity, that is, they bear witness to the reality of the psyche. And the upward movement eternalizes and the downward movement personalizes. So I'll just read you the beginning of this woman's LSD experience. This was a woman, a professional woman who was also the mother of 3 children who was in treatment with her. And she describes her experience in these words. I knew I was on my way when a releasing and delicious sense of floating in the atmosphere took over and engulfed my entire being. My sense of being contained in the body dissolved. I laughed with delight and said out loud, now I remember what it's like to be without a body. I was in contact with a new level of being, fully conscious but without embodiment. My awareness took form in mind, and I had resisted being born into the world of my present incarnation. I understood why. Air is my true element, the matrix of my being. The ecstasy of being free of body, the aging process, backaches, headaches, creaky joints. I was no longer confined by the time-space dimension on Earth. How amazing to be me, fully aware, conscious, and yet without a physical vehicle. And this was followed by many, many other visions. And then there became a complex cycle of laughter and tears, laughter usually connected with an opening of her arms and legs, and weeping with contraction and closing of the body. She moved back through countless ages of mankind, experienced her body in countless births and deaths and rebirths. She found herself in different parts of the world, mainly Europe, with more simple peasants and farmers. And this goes on. It's really quite beautiful. And the sense of oneness with the universe, with the birth-death process, experienced through the body, self, totality, overwhelmed me with grace. It's as though I had been given the gift so precious that I need never ask again, what is the meaning of my life? So Edinger said, the remarkable similarity between this LSD vision and Priestley's dream indicates that such experiences have an objective validity. Thus, they bear witness to the reality of the psyche. So I think that is part of my experience, is the validity of the reality of the psyche, which can come through in these experiences. So let's see, was anything else I wanted to say about that? So that's really, I think, all I want to say about Jung. As I said, there was Margot Kuttner in 1959 who worked with LSD in very small doses. She was a Jungian analyst and wrote about it. And Ronald Sandison, who was a Jungian therapist and psychiatrist, and he did a great deal of work, and he tried to talk to Jung, but Jung was never available when he wanted to talk to him. Michael Fordham, a very famous British Jungian, urged caution in the use of LSD-assisted psychotherapy. He really, really supported the relationship of the patient-therapist and active imagination. And he had his questions about the passivity of the medicine experiences and wondered about the integration of the conscious and unconscious material. So that's all I want to say about Jung at this point. And I wanted to now tell you a little bit about the California Institute of Integral Studies program. I was in this last year's cohort. I think the first cohort was in 2016. There were approximately, I think, 300 in my cohort, half on the West Coast, half on the East Coast, but it included Europe and Asia and South Africa. And I don't even remember all the countries. The average age was 41. There were 3 Jungian analysts in the program, and I was one of them. So in this program, we covered so much. I have not ever in my life had such an intensive, rigorous year. I don't know why I didn't expect this, but I didn't. And we studied scientific research in psychedelic medicines. And Albert Hoffer, I think it was 1938, when he discovered the molecules of LSD in Switzerland. And so we have been reading research on all kinds of psychedelic medicines, and we studied molecular and neurobiology, global ethnobotany, ancient ritual practices of indigenous cultures, and MAPS was a part of our training, the MAPS research. And MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, headed by Rick Doblin. And I think it was around 1986 when he started striving to have MDMA for psychotherapy, particularly with trauma in veterans. And that's when they started structuring the research and going after funding. And I had no idea the enormous amount of funding involved. And all of the research with MDMA, as far as I understand, was private funding. The government did not help. And I learned more about the process of research and how difficult it is to structure the studies, fund it, please the DEA and the FDA. And there is just so much work that has gone into allowing this medicine to be brought to the public. Part of that is for its safety, and part of that is for its efficacy. And this institute is training psychotherapists in order to do that work when it's legal. So part of our MAPS training was to view videos of the therapy by a number of therapists, trained therapists, of military veterans from, I believe it was the Afghanistan and Iraq war. I think it was mostly Afghanistan wars, and also personal trauma, car accident death experience in a woman who was treated with this medicine. There are other, I can't remember if there were other videos too that we studied, but several veterans. And we learned the form of treatment that MAPS uses, which is considered a gold standard. And it involves screening, a very thorough preparation period of it at 3 to 4 hours, then the medicine itself, then the following day, integration hours, then there's a period of time, and that's repeated 3 times. So in fact, it was enormously expensive, and there was a pair of therapists for each. They tried to balance male and female. So it seems like it's going to happen, but it has been just a Herculean effort to bring this to the public. And then we studied research focused on healing emotional and moral wounds of war and PTSD in military veterans and victims of childhood trauma, which is part of MAPS. We spent time addressing social justice and systemic racism, both in medical systems, and really beginning to think about the inequities in access to these medicines in the future. We're already thinking about that. And I think we're all thinking about that in the medical system in general. We worked on creating a beloved community in our class, but further than that, in the community. And that was that was a challenge at times. You know, there was conflict in some of the groups, and there was resolution in some, and some wasn't resolved, but it was dynamic and it was honest, and people really tried to listen to one another. We talked a great deal about legalization and ethical responsibilities for the therapist, for the research setting, and for the field in general. And the people who applied had to be licensed practitioners, psychiatrists, social workers, doctors, therapists, chaplains, a few analysts, a number of other people, but it was very difficult to get into. It was not meant so much to keep people out, nurse practitioners, all kinds of very, very devoted practitioners in human service. And we went over ethical guidelines, and we were vetted and evaluated and mentored the whole way. So, I mean, it was a very intensive program. So I'm very glad I took part in it, and I'm very grateful. So I'm going to shift now out of a linear place. But before I do want to say thank you to not only the board, but all the artists and the poets and musicians and film and video makers, many whose names I don't know. This is by Marnie Rector, Ricker, who gave me permission. This was on a MAPS bulletin, and I liked it so much, I asked her, could I bring it to a presentation and use it? And she gave me permission. And I also want to thank the technology gurus that created the internet, the user interface designers, the network builders, the security experts, the Zoom folks, and the numerous administrators who are unnamed and unseen that have developed these tools for all of us to do programs like this, but also, are helping in the war effort. So I'm deeply appreciative to those hermetic wizards behind the scenes. And I want to thank my cohorts in my study groups in CIIS and my friends and family who have been supportive and curious, loving my life and work and my very soul. So I'd like to take just a moment to sit with this mandala. And Jung talked about a mandala as a magic circle. And he often said they occurred spontaneously and they helped organize the psyche and center and ground. So this is Marnie Rector's piece, and she calls this the medicine wheel. And it's a prayer for water, earth, fire, and air, and for spirit. So I'll take a moment to call in the spirits of the East, the element of air, the flying eagle. Please guide us, awaken. Spirits of the South, the element of fire, all the growing plants and the young people and all the creatures with fins and feet and feathers. I welcome you. I welcome your energy. I welcome spring. And I bring in the spirit of the West, the setting sun, the place of the turning inward and the element of water, swirling, dynamic, fluid capacities, and the introversion of our attention, birthing, dying, dreaming, sleeping. I invite the spirits of the West and the remembrance of ancestors. And to the spirits of the North, I welcome in the element of earth, which is really a coagulation of the alchemy of all the fine elements that make this earth, this magical, beautiful, watery and green planet. We so appreciate you. The spirits of the North, the wisdom keepers, the elders, the great white buffalo people, and the deer spirit, and all those departed elders. And I remember Thayer and Anita Green, our elders who have recently passed on. We ask for your guidance in all of this work that has to do with the heart of humanity and the soul. So now bring your attention to the center of the mandala, of which you are. Your very life, your very heart is the center of the mandala. Please bless yourself and remember that you are connected to the cosmos. There is stardust in your bones. So, now I want to talk some about non-ordinary states of consciousness. On the left is a wooden mask from the mounds in Ohio, I believe. And you notice the large ears for hearing. And you notice the antlers growing out of the mask. This is a shamanic mask. And in the middle is a Siberian shaman. I call this the grandfather, my Siberian ancestor, made of stone. And they're holding two branches from, again, the world tree, topped with birds, the spirit birds that fly to find souls, to bring back messages. This is the Siberian shaman. And then on the right is a spontaneous drawing that I did when I was just a teenager. There I am growing my horns, just have no idea where that came from, but that's my drawing. So I want to say that we are constantly preparing and practicing non-ordinary states of consciousness. I'm going to name these so you can quietly go inside and just think about these things. But these are non-ordinary, non-linear states of consciousness: sleeping, dreaming, hypnagogic states that are between sleeping and waking, hypnosis, imagining, active imagination, active listening and making, active seeing, active receiving of story, poetry, and music, drumming, rattling, movement and flow states, yoga, tai chi, riding horses, riding bikes, all kinds of sports, making love, movement, flow states, dance, whirling, rolling, curling, reverie, reflection, daydreaming, fantasizing, meditation of all kinds, meditation on sound, meditation on image, prayer, mantra, singing, sounding, chanting, breathwork, sexuality and making love, orgasm, le petit mort, the little death, labor and delivery, birthing and dying, and near-death experiences, feverish states of hallucination. There's also shock frozen moments with heightened awareness of sound, smell, taste that may come with trauma, and they may be dissociated. Dementias, forgetting, coma. So this is a little mandala I made. The horizontal line going from birth to death is a horizontal dimension. It's linear time. It's chronological time. You've heard of chronos. Well, the word chronological is related to the Greek deity Kronos. And it's progressive. It builds on itself. It makes sense. It's logical and linear. We all go through this. And then there's the other dimension, which is the vertical dimension, the non-linear, the depth dimension, the ascent dimension. This is being space, the Greek word kairos, which means this present moment. The vertical dimension almost always has the sense of being in a state of being. So it's a kind of an eternal moment. And if you really think about it, we are constantly in a sign, kind of a waveform throughout our day, even throughout an hour of the day. We are moving in and out of linear and non-linear experiences. We just usually don't pay attention to that. But even in this talk so far, you've been in the linear dimension of listening to language and processing it. But also, I'll say a word like dreaming, and you may drop into a memory of a dream, and then you'll come back. So we're constantly moving back and forth in these dimensions. So consciousness is a very dynamic state of being. One of the things I learned in breathwork, Tab Sparks, who was Stan Grof's assistant for many years, talked about the yoga of the cross. And he was saying, whenever there's a real conflict, which often is in the horizontal dimension, and you're ready to fight with somebody or blame somebody, he said, drop into the vertical dimension and look at the history, look at the experiences you've had, and you can often move through that experience in a very different way rather than staying on the horizontal dimension. So now, with that as kind of a prelude, I would like to move into telling you my story, because I think we all have a story. I'm going to tell you my story, but parallel to listening to mine, you will also be listening to your own story, which will be slightly different than mine, but we're both human beings. So on the left is me as an infant. I'm about 8 months old. I'm on an airplane, Pan Am. That picture was in a magazine. I'm looking at the stewardess. And we are going to join my father in Panama. He is a deep sea diver in the US Navy, a career chief, and always his duty places were always by the ocean. So what is going to happen is in about a month, I'm going to have an enormous traumatic experience that I had not put together all the pieces until this past year. And I was working on integrating a ketamine experience, and a very clear memory came through. And it was almost a matrix of some of the trauma in my life. So it's quite amazing that we can work on integrating our experience until we can't stay conscious anymore in this life. And in the middle, that's me in midlife. And I'm on a beach in Mexico in the Bay of San Ignacio, scouting for the gray whales. And by the time I was in middle age, I had a career as a Jungian analyst. I had a wonderful family. I had 2 children who were doing very well. And I had been doing breath work, and I was really an adventurer and loved to spend time in the ocean and with the gray whales, and a lot of time with the dolphins. And I'll tell you more about that. But they're very, very important to me. And they were in my early childhood as well. And then that's me about a month ago. And I'm turning 75 soon. And I have reached a point in my life where I have a view. And I've lost about 10 people in the last couple of years. And it is very essential that I do as much integrating as possible and start sharing some of the wisdom of my life more openly. I have realized just how enormously precious my life is. And I would say that I have worked with my personal trauma consciously for over 50 years. And I can honestly say I am a pretty happy person at this point. It's not that I don't feel depression or sadness, I do, but I know the preciousness of the gifts and the people who have helped me along the way. And I want to say something about community. It is so important to build community all the way through your life. You will need it at every stage, and we all need help, both human and divine, especially in the hard times. So now I'm going to leave the screen dark for a little bit, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my beginning. And it is a very dark period. I was born into a family of two, a mother and a father. Both, the mother's side was from Ireland and the father's side was from Ukraine. And both my parents lost their fathers relatively early, and they both had disturbed mothers. My mother's mother was an alcoholic easily from her roaring 20s onward. And my Russian grandmother was essentially went mad when she was in her 40s, and stayed in that state until she died at 90. So both of my parents were quite unparented. They married after the war. It was not a well thought out marriage, to say the least. But I was a wanted child, and I am very glad about that. And my mother had had a very bad experience with the Navy hospital when she had her first child, but got a private doctor and she got help. She hired a private nurse and had a very good doctor. And although she was anxious about having me, it was okay. It was better. So I'll skip over the minor trauma. There's so much. When we went to Panama, and then we went to Key West, and we had some other duty places, but we always came back to Washington, D.C. So by the time I was 4 years old, we came back and we were living with my grandmother in Washington, D.C. My father was starting to separate from the U.S. Navy, which had been his home, which had been his structure, which had been his external psyche in many ways. And as he started to separate from the Navy, he started to decompensate. And he went into a psychotic experience. That would be the psychiatric description. Another way to describe it is he went into a night sea journey that was very profound. So from 4 to 8 years old, he was in a psychotic, deep experience. He was raging. He was dangerous. He was a very big man. He was violent. And I was 4 to 8. My sister was about 6 to 11 or so. And my mother was pregnant with a third child. The Navy decided that they weren't going to put him in a hospital. They wanted to keep him at home because I don't even know why. And Ed Tick, who's very experienced with PTSD in military families, is very unusual. But they sent a therapist to my grandmother's home. And by grace, he was a Unitarian minister and a Jungian. And he would come weekly. I don't remember if it was more than once a week, but they'd sit in the living room and they would talk about my father's experience in his early life, his experience in the war, World War II. They'd talk about philosophy and existential psychology. They'd talk about Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. They would talk about the existential dilemma of war. They talked about spirituality. They talked about Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, Confucianism, and boy, I don't even remember all the rest of it. They talked about nature, the profundity of nature. And I was 4 and I was kind of loose in the house, and I could lay on the floor and listen or be under a table in the dining room watching. I am quite sure I didn't understand many of the words, but what I did understand is there was a person there my father was listening to and was heard by. And I understood that this relationship was the vehicle for saving my father's sanity. Now, the parallel thing that was happening is that from 4 to 8 years old, I was highly neglected. My mother was busy. There was nobody watching me. My father was very busy with his own psyche process. And there were very, very bad things that happened with teenage boys in the neighborhood who terrorized me, hounded me, molested me, psychically tortured me, physically, sexually abused me. I was violated in many ways over and over, and I tried to get help and I was ignored. So all of that was happening parallel to my father's psychosis. And Dr. Tice was his name, had my father begin writing. He wrote poetry and fairy tales. He wrote each of us one on his emergence from his psychosis. And he had him painting mandalas. I still remember the mandala he painted, and he was wood carving, and he was carving Moby Dick. And I remember standing in the garage watching him, and he carved a tiny little rowboat with oars, and Moby Dick, who was rising, breaching out of the ocean, the roiling ocean. And what I do know is my father's did return to sanity, and he was functional. He did get a job, a part-time job during this period. He was a guard in the jail, the DC jail, and he had a gun, and he had the gun at home. So it was an extraordinarily dangerous place. Now, when my father was very young, and he told me about these things, he had mystical experiences. Maybe they were dissociative, I don't know, but he saw angels and he felt very in touch with the spiritual world. I suspect that he was also quite abandoned and neglected. His father went back to Russia to take part in the 5-year plan under Stalin and was killed upon arrival. My grandmother had hallucinations through her time in an asylum, and I was able to get the paperwork and read her the notes, psychiatric notes, and quite ironically, her visions and fears were of Stalin surrounding her house with troops, digging a tunnel in and eating her heart out. And it is chilling for me to feel that happening in Mariupol now. So it's a sort of return of the repressed. Anyway, by the time I was in school, it was a great, wonderful thing for me to get out of the house and the neighborhood. And I loved school. I had wonderful teachers, and there were some wonderful neighbors that were very kind to me. And I think that it really helped me to be in school. I think I started drawing. I started drawing and doing pastels at that point. And I was in catechism when I was 7, and I was being molested. And I was told that that would stop when I had First Holy Communion. And before that happened, I was cornered by a group of teenagers, and I actually can't remember all of it. But what I know is I climbed up on a 4th floor windowsill and was at 7 years old planning to jump out the window. I had become exhausted and there was no way out. And again, a moment of synchronicity or grace, someone rang the doorbell downstairs and my mother answered it. And it was one of the abusers who'd seen me on the windowsill and came to say I was on the windowsill. He didn't say why. And I came down the stairs and sat on the steps, not close. And he left. And my mother never asked me why I was on the windowsill. I mean, it was so consistent that my mental health was absolutely ignored. So probably what really saved my life is we moved to the country when I was 8 years old. And I then turned to nature and school, and I was free. I rode horses, I ran in the fields, I did artwork. I mean, I really thrived in school and the structure of school. I had wonderful teachers. I was a very bright, white little girl, attractive. I had that privilege. We were poor, but I really found my gifts. By the time I was in high school, they allowed me, I had a wonderful art teacher. He allowed me 2 hours every afternoon to work in the studio, and I was able to make a portfolio. And I got scholarships to fine art schools. I had award-winning art. Some of it was in the National Gallery in a juried show when I was just 16. I sold art, but it was going to art school was going to be my way out. And I haven't really talked much about horses, and I won't, but they were a big part of my life. I worked at a stable. So when I was about 17, and the tension in my home, I had come home from art school because my parents were divorcing. I was actually just going to leave, but I confronted my parents and spoke my truth, and was assaulted by both parents. And I ran outside, and my father ran after me and jumped on me. And I had a concussion and broken ribs, and somehow was able to come back in the house and call the mother of my friend, who was a nurse, who came to get me. And I left, and I started therapy just about the next day, but I was in shock, as you know. So I'm going to ask Larry Peltz, Dr. Larry Peltz, my dear old friend, 40 years, to read a Mary Oliver poem that I think speaks to this. And poetry really reaches the soul. And Mary Oliver's been special for me, and I know to many of you. So Larry, would you read?
Yeah. No, thanks, Penny. Yeah, it was actually about 30 years ago that Penny sent me a cassette tape of a talk by poet David White, called Poetry of Self-Compassion. And this was the first poem in his talk. And it's one that many of you know, probably most of you know, that I've read and contemplated many times. So I really invite you to just drop into the body, however you do that. This is the journey. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. "Mend my life," each voice cried. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. "Mend my life," each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to save, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. Thanks.
Thanks, Larry. Beautiful. Ah. So I'm going to share a little bit of the gift that I was granted in this life. And that's the only early drawing I did I was about 4.5 or 5. And as you can see, identified as a female. And I am reaching for the sun. And I'm also reaching toward a person who's on the other side. I think that's a male. And I'm really not quite in connection with either. But you can see the sun in the upper left. And if you look to the right, you'll probably see the very dark clouds that were over me at the time. And the next drawing I'm going to share, I was a teenager, and this is an old woman sitting by the stove. I think she's sewing. And if you look on the stove, there's a pot of water and it's heated and there's steam coming out. And that's that's a charcoal drawing. And then on the right, I did a few years later in art school, and this is a lino cut, and this is of a little cabin in the woods, kind of a glimpse of myself. And it's a safe space. And look at the chimney, look at the smoke coming out of the chimney. And if you look at the trees, you'll see the wound in several trees. But there is that movement, that life that just thrives. I love that print, actually. But I didn't realize until I put those together how much fire there was in me that was coming through. You see the sun, you see the steaming pot on the stove, and you see there's a fire in the fireplace. So somehow, through all that trauma, I was able to retain the gift of that creative spark. And my parents actually really let me do artwork. They actually appreciated it. And I think that was also one of my saving graces. And these are 2 paintings I did as a teenager. The one on the left is the kind of grounded, hardworking me after Van Gogh. I love that painting. And that won many, many awards when I was a teenager. And the one on the right is the painting I did before my father jumped on me. And I could have been killed. I don't think he intended to kill me, but I could have easily been killed in that tackle. But there's a fire chasing those horses. There's some kind of fire in the fields, and they're all fleeing. But again, there's that fiery quality, which I deeply appreciate in my artwork. And I had come back from art school during that crisis, and I decided to go on, and I went to a community college for a few years to ground myself. I decided I was not going to be an artist to make a living at being an artist. I would be an artist, but I needed that for my soul. So I knew I was going to study psychology and art. And I had what treasures. This was a community college right outside of Washington, D.C. And my psych professor, my first psych professor, was a very quiet, serious man. And I would meet with him after class. And one day he rolled up his sleeve and showed me that he had been a child in Auschwitz. And he showed me his tattoo. And he helped me get my first job in the mental health field. I also had a social psych professor who used to have a group of us come out to his tree farm and visit. And it was wonderful. And he had been present at the Nuremberg trials. And I had another psych professor who was a woman psychologist who had done all her work at Bellevue in New York. So some of the community colleges have rare gems, and the classes were small, and I studied Russian literature, honors literature, and I began doing artwork again. I had stopped for a while after the trauma. And then I transferred to the University of Maryland and went on in art and psychology and on into graduate school. When I was at the University of Maryland, I co-directed a suicide prevention harm reduction center, all volunteer, the students and community people under the auspices of the counseling center. And that was when there was a lot of drug use and very little of the drugs were, there was a lot of bad stuff going around. So there were health crises, there were overdoses, et cetera. And I had a wonderful mentor, was the first person who'd ever been in analysis, and he was a New Yorker and very dear man to me, Dr. Carl. And that was a time I became interested in LSD. I'd read about it, I'd thought about it, and while I was at the university, I had enough good friends, and I read a little book called The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience by Gene Houston and Masters, 1966. A Dell paperback, $1.95. Precious little book. Anyway, and it talked about the beneficial effect of psychedelic mystical experiences. And it was to take the subject through a process of experiencing essence in such a way that it illuminated all existence, making him more interested in and responsive to the phenomenon of existence that he'd never known before. Thus, instead of retreating from the phenomenal world, as often happens with a traditional mystic, the psychedelic subject was inspired by the process of his experience to a kind of flight toward reality. Anyway, it's a wonderful little book. It's on your little reading list. And in that book, I learned about the miracle of the Marsh Chapel, I believe it was, at BU, and the Good Friday experiment. It was the Good Friday service, and it was an experiment for Walter Pankey's doctoral dissertation. He was, I think he was studying philosophy. I don't know where that paper is, but he was studying religious philosophy, and he set up this experiment of there would be 10 subjects who took psilocybin, high dose, and 10 that didn't. The upstairs, there was the music going on and the religious sermons, and downstairs, this group was having psilocybin. And they weren't terribly experienced, the sitters, but it went on, and it was actually quite successful, except there was one person who I think ran into the streets proclaiming, his religious experience. And luckily, there were enough guides to go get him and bring him back. But that wasn't in the literature, but I heard about that later. And later, many years later, it was repeated and done very carefully. So I had heard about that, and I read about it, and I thought, that's what I want to do. So I set that up for myself. I had a sitter. I prepared. I had a beautiful list of music to be played, all classical music and Gregorian chant and Holst the Planets and Vivaldi and Vaughan Williams and Respugi, and many others, beautiful music. And my intention was for healing sacred experience. And my sitter was an older woman who'd never had a medicine experience, but I trusted her deeply. And I had a profoundly religious, sacred experience that changed my life. I'm not going to talk about a lot of the detail of it, but it was truly what has been written about. And what I didn't realize, because how could I know? I had no idea how to integrate that experience. And it was so enormous. It was like trying to put the world back in a jar or something. It was way beyond my capacity to integrate this. I did not know what to do. I had a therapist at the University Counseling Center who was not the least bit interested in psychedelic medicine, but I did have several older colleagues who just kind of steadied me. And I turned to art to help me ground the experience. And this was the first drawing I made when I came out of the LSD experience. And once I drew this picture of the world tree, the great planted tree, and there you see again the wound on the left, which is in my other drawings, I knew that I was going to be okay. I knew that I could ground through nature and through art, and that I would make it somehow. And of course I did. And it was at this time, a little while later, I did this first mandala of my own. And this came spontaneously. I didn't know really anything about mandalas other than I knew my father had painted one. And this was a very organizing, grounding experience to do this picture. And there's all this rotation of the ascent and descent and the darkness of the depths of the shadow world and the trauma and everything else. And then there's the beatific horns of Hathor moon at the top. And it's containing an oceanic experience. And there is the little boat that my father carved when he did Moby Dick. Here it appears in my artwork. And there is a mountain, or it's a mountain, but what it really was a pyramid, because there was a long part of my LSD experience of seeing and experiencing the great pyramids that went on into eternity. But it looks kind of like a mountain here, but there is something about that triangular form. And I believe that's an image of the cloud of unknowing, but it's also the cross of the ascended Christ. And I had quite a very deep experience of Christ in my LSD experience, of the union of the mystical Christ. And I had never drawn dolphins before, but there they appeared. And mythically, they often come to assist lost sailors. And they were also known to bring King Arthur's body to Avalon in the water. They accompanied his little boat. So they're also known as psychopomps, or guide of the psyche. So there's the dolphins had begun to show up in my psyche. Now, it's about this time that I somehow, again, grace, synchronicity, I heard Stan Grof was hiring for LSD research. And I looked into it and I called him, and I went to the Catonsville facility, which was associated with the Johns Hopkins program. And there I interviewed with Stan for many, many hours, and he accepted me into the LSD training program. And he took me down the hall, and I met Bill Richards for the first time, and I met Albert Kurland. And we sat and we talked about my experience, and they shared some of their experiences. And I honestly felt I was going to be okay, that I had found my tribe, that it was very reassuring that there were people who knew the immense power of this medicine, and they were doing formal research. So I was going to be trained as a sitter, and the research was going to be with terminal cancer patients and with extreme alcoholics. And I was very interested in death and dying, and especially after my LSD experience, the realm of death and dying became fascinating and interesting to me. The realm of music was very, very important, and meditation. They all came flying forward for me to begin to work in and to integrate in. I had to finish my master's, and it was a few months away. So I was doing that. And during that time, all the LSD, all the psychedelic research was shut down by the DEA through Nixon. And that was the end of the research for many years. And that, as you know, has returned in the last, I can't remember how long now, but that's Bill Richards now. I met him when he's in his 80s now, and I met him when he was, I guess he was in his he might have been in his late 30s, and Stan was in his 40s when I met him. So let me see, did I miss something? Yeah. So I couldn't do the LSD training. So my husband, my partner and I, who became my husband, moved to Boston. He had a postdoctoral in expressive therapies. And I studied in the Eureka spiritual program for a while. And I started a Jungian, we were all seeing, a number of us started seeing a psychiatrist, unbeknownst to each of us, Dr. Eugene Smith, who had an office on Beacon Street, and there was a rotating Guggenheim exhibit. And he was absolutely wonderful. He really, really was interested in my psyche and my dreams. And we came to a point in the work together, and he said, you have to leave. You have to be trained as a Jungian. And I don't think I would have felt privileged enough, educated enough, intelligent enough to be a Jungian analyst if it had Eugene Smith not said, you really need to do this. Eugene had been studying with Ira Pergoff and did a lot of work with writing and journaling. And so I looked into a Jungian program, and there wasn't one yet in Boston, but I decided I couldn't afford to go to Zurich. So I wrote to them and said I'd like to interview. And it just so happened that the 5 analysts, 4 or 5, I think there were 5, were accepted by the International in Rome that year to start a training program in Boston. So I was trying to decide whether to go on in Tibetan Buddhism and take a doctorate in that, because I was studying with lamas and the Dalai Lama, and I loved that work. And there was a lot of meditation and sacred art and practices which were dear to my heart. But I thought I would give Jung a chance, and I had a series of dreams. And I had an initiatory dream involving holding serpents. And I won't go into the detail of the dream or even the detail of this piece of art, but this art came from that dream. And later I found this image of a Minoan snake goddess. And that was from a culture that was far more focused on art and the feminine. So I decided to apply to be trained as a Jungian analyst. And the morning of my interview in 1978, I had a dream that I was given a tile, an ancient tile, and it had pictures of dolphins on it like this. I didn't really understand what it was, but we had a wonderful discussion, the analysts and I, and they did accept me into the training program. And later, I found this very tile was found in the palace at Knossos in ancient Greece. So my psyche was really already activated at a mythical level, and dolphins traveled with me in dreams all through my training. And in my Jungian analysis, I did a lot of shadow work, a lot of work on grief. And I think this collage that I did speaks to the grief and the depression and the turning inward and the shadowy, ghostly period of fleeing with the mother and the darkness that was going on in my life early. And there were always allies. There were always feathered creatures that helped. I used to play eagle when I was very little, and I had no idea what that was about. So, and then I did a lot of work on the divine child inside myself. I was slowly realizing how precious this little girl was and what she had gone through. And this is a collage of homage to the divine child. And there you see so many of the feminine images of nature and the deities, and just beauty associated with the deep feminine. And I used to sit on one of my grandmother's Asian carpets and wait for the mail, and the mailman, who was really a dear friend of mine. And I loved the idea that something could come in from the outside world. But I think that through the course of my life, I've been reclaiming this divine child within myself, and she's very wise and she wants to be present. And I think she's really the heart of the artist in me. So during my analysis, I was incubating and growing myself in my own psychic womb. And in the middle is an image. My mother used to take me to the National Gallery, and this was a statue from the Aztec culture. It was at least, I think, 15,000 years old, or I don't know, I could be wrong, but I used to stop and stand and stare at this, and the whole idea of childbirth and the duplication, the two, the one becoming the two, just fascinated me. And so there it is. And it went deeply into me. And there on the right is my former wonderful husband and my two sons. And that's Jesse is about 4. And they were both born naturally. And with Jesse, I had visions. I had mystical experiences. I had astonishing experiences along with the pain and agony of labor. It felt like I experienced the earth giving birth to the mountain chains when my pelvic bones moved apart, and very, very visionary birth experiences. And when Jesse crowned, the universe stood still and the 1,000-petaled lotus unfolded. And with Gabriel, it was like being in the jungle of South America, and there were wars and blood, and it was not beatific. It was enormously long birth and very painful, but very precious, both of them. Jesse, the one curious about the toes there, is now a physician in Seattle, an internist and hospitalist. And Gabriel, the one in the water, is now a very high-level principal engineer at a Silicon Valley company building the cloud, helping us do this. So I feel these are very precious men in my life. And I feel I incarnated during the birthing process. And very interesting, none of the Jungians were interested in the birth process. None of the Jungians took a deep interest in my non-ordinary state work and experiences. And I'm very sad about that. And after my kids were a little older, it was very clear that I needed to go and swim with the dolphins. And I synchronously got an invitation to do a breathwork group in Florida Keys. And it would be led by women, a woman cell biologist, scientist, a researcher, and an Australian healer. And they were both trained in Australia, and they were very, very involved with nature and the indigenous people and the dream time. So I went and I started doing breath work, and that was 1989. And I swam in the wild with dolphins and then would do breathing sessions and artwork between. And I've done that from 1989 to 2016. So I had profound experiences of being very close to these wild, intelligent creatures. And in one experience, one took my hand in its flipper, which inside the flipper are the same bones of the hand that we have. And when it took my hand, I had an experience of crossing thousands of years in communication with this creature. And they are so intelligent. I feel so fortunate to have had that experience. And that was my first eye-to-eye swimming side by side with one of them. And that's the one on the right is a picture of kind of reliving one of my birth experiences in the breath work and doing artwork afterwards. And this is me with Stan Grof. This is, I think it's 2014 or I think 14. And this is not long after his wife had died. And Stan had softened considerably between the time I met him in the 70s and this in, 30 years later, 40 years. And he had considerably softened and his feminine side had really developed. He'd been doing breath work for years and years and reached thousands and thousands of people all over the world, including Russia and China. And he was just, I consider him a mentor and a great teacher for me. He began as a psychiatrist and he'd had a 5-day-a-week, he had more analysis than I ever had in that intense way, in that very classical way, and left that all behind. So after the breath work, I really started writing about a patient who I did long work with, and I was invited to come and live with she and her husband and family and help her die. And I wrote about that. And this is when I started really paying deep attention to the dying process and all the non-ordinary states around that. And so the middle picture is a collage I did. And that's what this woman looked like after, in about 2 or 3 days after she died. She too had began to dry and looked like an indigenous elder, not quite this, darkened and whatnot, but this is from National Geographic picture of an ancient woman who was buried, I think, in Mongolia with her horses. So she was well-to-do. But my friend was so generous and had given me all of her journals and dreams to write from and asked me to share with the world that process. And then on the far right is the artwork I did after the ketamine journey I guess it was last summer, which was quite a profound journey from the space of non-being. It moved into the Mississippi Delta and the bones of the slaves and the buried secrets that we haven't attended to. But then I thought I left it there, but then I kept writing and reflecting on that experience for weeks and weeks. And what emerged was a memory of working with a sand tray in analysis. And in the sand tray, I buried a baby in the sand and cried and cried and cried. My own baby was 9 months old, so it was the exact age when I was buried in the sand. But my Jungian analyst and I never got it, that it was a real experience and that I was having a memory. But part of what came out of the ketamine experience was I fully understood that I had been buried in that sand and I was having a near-death experience as an infant. And I got from a picture that my mother had written on the back of the picture with me buried in the sand, struggling, screaming, ha ha. And that was the matrix of a great deal of my early childhood, is not being seen, being mocked and my trauma being totally neglected. So I want you to know that I have been in psychotherapy and analysis, supervision, and mentorship for 50 years, and I intend to continue until I can no longer function, because I know how deep the psyche is and how mysterious and dark it is, and what a blessing. So if I can get the sound on this. Okay, this is a little sound clip from the Changing of the Gods series with Rick Tarnas, and it focuses on, particularly on astrology, the astrology of Uranus and Pluto. And this is just a little clip of Stan, and I thought you would appreciate this.
A vast domain which we now call transpersonal, where you can have experiences of identification with other people, experiencing group consciousness, identify with various animal species, even botanical species. You can also have experiences from what Jung called the archetypal, mythological, unconscious, where you can have experiences of mythological beings and mythological realms from other cultures, whether or not you know about those cultures. So that was one major revolutionary observation. The other one was the discovery of a self-healing potential of the psyche. When you change consciousness, it activates your self-healing potential, and the therapist becomes what Jung called co-adventurer, not the fixer, not the one who already has all the answers and is guiding the patient, but it's more intelligently supports what is unfolding already. At the beginning, I thought I was creating a new map of the psyche for psychiatry, which was made possible by this powerful tool. Like when microscope came, it opened up a whole new area, the telescope, and I felt we had something like a telescope for psychiatry. And I realized this was not a new map at all. Right. You know, similar kinds of concepts were all around for not centuries, but millennia in these shamanic maps of consciousness and the great spiritual philosophies of the East. The fact that we have such narrow psychiatry, such superficial psychiatry, has very serious consequences. It means that we diagnose as psychotic certain states which potentially could be transformative, healing, even evolutionary. That vast domain which.
Oops. So I have finished my formal presentation, and I have a little meditation I'd like to do before we close, but we are going to have some time for questions and answers or reflections. So Andy, I am going to stop sharing and come back to the gallery and see everybody. Hello. So Andy, do you want to, or Erica, do you want to handle any interactions, please?
Erica, if you'd like to recognize people, folks, you can use the raise hand feature. It's under the reactions button.
Jonathan, would you like to speak?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm. Let's see. It's Jonathan.
Hi, Penelope.
Can
My
you
question
wait? Oh, there you are. Okay.
My question is, or just a thought that I'm wondering your opinion on. It's often made me frustrated and even angry to know that, you know, in America, I can walk into a store and get an implement of killing very easily, but these tools for healing, at least since the Nixon administration, have been so suppressed. But then now that we are having kind of a resurgence, today I got an ad served to me online for something called Mind Bloom, where they send you like a little kit with ketamine and little eye covers, and I don't even know how it worked. I didn't even want to click on it. Where on the other side of the spectrum, we're already starting to see these sacred medicines getting commodified.
Mhm.
And I'm curious your opinion on both sides of those spectrums.
Well, we're certainly talking about it in CPTR. I would say with probably most of the people I've learned from and worked with this year, feel very strongly about well-trained psychedelic assisted therapists that are well-trained and certified, if possible, who will use something close to the gold standard of the investment in preparatory counseling, therapy to prepare and to be present with the person in person during a medicine experience that's legal. And then the hard work and the hours of integration. Hopefully the person will then go on and continue their own therapy. But I feel very uncomfortable with kind of a do-it-yourself kit. And I think it's sad. And I think, I agree with you. There's going to be this sort of thing that goes on. And I think there's always the issue of greed. And we're still kind of in the Wild West in terms of regulations. And ketamine is legal, but I think there's some people who treat it very, very carefully. I'm thinking of Raquel Bennett in Berkeley with Kriya Institute. You might want to read about her work. But I know those things are happening, and it makes me very sad to see it become a commercial adventure, and the loss of the sacred and the loss of the very important connection with the therapist, not so much to guide per se, but as you find your own inner healing wisdom. So I'm with you on that. It is disturbing.
Okay, Camilla, you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Penelope. Such a rich presentation, and I literally feel like I've been following in your wake, including getting our degree at the University of Maryland 10 years after you. So my first breathwork experience was 35 years ago, and it was profound, transformational, and started a long journey, which I won't go into. But could you speak a little more, because you referred to Grof, and I think you referred to the breathwork, but could you say a little bit more about that in your journey? And also, for me, it was very, I only did it a few times, but it definitely took me into a different state of consciousness, a very profound one. Why now? Why, I assume you've done breath work along the way. Why do you feel that hallucinogens, psychedelics are so important that you're willing to invest this precious part of your life in the work?
Well, I continue to do breath work and still do. I'm headed off to a breathwork module in April. They're going to have the first one. I feel like it's a big secret that breathwork is incredibly important and has enormous potential. I see willing is nodding. Willing and I have been in some breath work. I spent 10 years studying with the Grof facilitators in Grof, and I'm certified. And so I deeply regard the holotropic breath work. I can't speak for all kinds of breath work, but I feel like the training was very good. And I feel the facilitating community has been very ethical and very good. And I think it's an excellent place to try out non-ordinary states. The thing about breathwork is you can come out of it much more quickly if need be. Once you take a medicine, you're in for the whole journey. And it's usually about a 3-hour experience, but I feel like there's very good containment, beautiful music, and I have had so many profound journeys and seen so many cultures and deities, and it's been very powerful. So I don't at all discount it, nor will I stop participating. And it's not that the medicine necessarily is better or whatever, but I'm really curious. And I feel the medicine, particularly the plant medicines, have something to teach me. And I feel there's great healing potential in both breathwork and in medicine. So it's neither, they're both powerful modalities. And I really encouraged, breathwork is legal. It's one breath away. And I think one of the things I like about breathwork is you have to work at it. You have to participate. You have to put an effort in it. And it really, to me, there was so much more embodiment in the breath work. So we all have a lot to learn. There is so much of us, of our human state, that we really aren't aware of. There's just great mystery in us. So thank you, Camilla. Keep going.
Willing, would you like to speak?
Penelope, thank you for this expansive, non-ordinary 2 hours.
Thanks, Willing. I've been for a few years.
I just think I'm so blessed to share this world with you in some way, and I see you as a somewhat. This is maybe a little grandiose, somewhat mythic heroine goddess on your journey. My question is, listening to your early years, there were all kinds of times when you could have ended in one way or another. And you, in fact, grew and matured. And I'm wondering on what would you highlight as the life preservers that kept you going, kept you alive? Both, it seemed like some were internal. I'm also wondering if there were external life preservers that got you through the first 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Well, I loved my grandmother. And even though she was an alcoholic and unprocessed, she loved me. So the attachment to my grandmother helped. I was her favorite. I also had to hear all the stories, but she taught me the rosaries and she made me vow to get a good education.
Wow.
Yeah. And I take vows pretty seriously. Yeah. Wow. So my grandmother and my Irish grandmother and nature. I love nature in so many ways, and my creative process in art. And that has taken me through many things. I always found good teachers. In public school, I had profound teachers. Wow. So I learned how to eat the crumbs. I had that capacity to just take the crumbs of kindness. And looking back, I see now that some of what I went through in my childhood were initiatory experiences. I began to learn things about non-ordinary states then. So Yeah, I survived all that, and I'm not ashamed of it. And in fact, I feel, distant from it. I feel great gratitude for all the suffering. But I had a wonderful first therapist, and I cried for the first year. I never talked. And long, deep relationships with therapists. I've had a mentor for 23 years. So attachment, my capacity to make attachments was not destroyed. And and I think I always felt this deep awakeness, even as a child. So, yeah.
Judy.
Penny, thank you so much for the depth of your story, and actually Willie prompted you to answer my question. I was going to ask you if you felt there was an association between the depth of your darkness, your trauma, and the breadth and height, as in your mandala, of your visionary experiences. And I just heard the answer, and I feel the redemption too of the fact that you say you were grateful for those experiences, for the dark times and the hard times. I mean, that's tells of a big compassionate heart. Yeah.
I remember coming out of a breathwork session, and the message was the capacity to hold darkness is related to the capacity to hold light. Yeah. So I have great compassion for my parents. My father was a deep sea diver in Pearl Harbor after the bombings. He dove over and over, bringing up the dismembered bodies, and tried to get the sailors out of the twisted wreckage of the Arizona. And he couldn't. And he couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. And those men were entombed, and they're still entombed. But he was sworn to secrecy and couldn't even talk about it until, I think, about 1986. Wow. So he had to bear that. And I never knew that. I mean, it was an impossible thing to bear. So my father and I really made peace. And he really was one of the most spiritual people I ever knew. And the fairy tale he wrote me was a great gift. And it had to do with, I'll tell you just because I'll tell you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was set in Persia, and King Amur had a beautiful stallion who was gone, and he lost it, and he was getting old, and he needed someone to find it. So he had a contest that if you could find the horse and paint the picture, you could get great riches. And in the story, the little girl wanted the chance to do this. Oh, and if you didn't do it in 24 hours, your head was chopped off. It was a much more elaborate story than I'm telling you, but the parents said, yes, you can go and try and paint the horse. So she goes and asks the king, and the king says to himself, did God send me a child? Did God send me a child to help me with this lost, profound horse? Whatever it was, his soul. So anyway, in the story, the little girl can't find the horse anywhere. And, the time is passing. She's crying. She falls asleep on the riverbank. And when she wakes up in the morning, the horse is there. And the horse lets her ride him back to the palace. And she never got to paint the picture, so she fully expected to be killed. But the king said, no, you did it. You brought it back. So I think that story guided me. And I think it was my father's way of loving us. He was a very deep person, and he wrote a story for each of us. Yeah. So thanks, Judy.
Penny, I just wanted to add a little bit about Jung, because Jung was very versed in non-ordinary states without psychedelics from childhood on. I'm
Right.
reading Black books now, and they're extraordinary. So he was an adept. So I just wanted to, he didn't need psychedelics.
Right. And none of us need psychedelics. None of us need psychedelics. And I had a dream where it was very clear we are the medicine. The plants can help us, the molecules can help us, but we are the medicine. We have those capacities within us. Jung knew it. So one more question, and I'd like to do a little meditation before we go. So Scott?
Hi, Penny. I just wanted to say, first and foremost, it has been an absolute honor to listen to you the last 2 hours. And just an incredible journey that you've taken us on. So I wanted to take a moment to pause before I say anything else and say that, wow, the fact that you've come to this point in your journey and concluded that you really need to share that wisdom is incredible. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
But I guess my question is very much along the same lines as the two previous speakers, but I suppose I'm wondering your take on sacred wounds and metabolizing that trauma, but also taking that to a healing capacity for other people and metabolizing other people's trauma with them. I wonder, because I've struggled with grief and I'm metabolizing quite a bit myself at this juncture, but I think that my calling, and I would imagine a lot of people on this call have a similar calling of taking that sacred wound and bringing it out into the world and healing much of it. So I'm wondering, to what capacity do you think that sacred wound is necessary, and in what ways do you think you can use it to help other people integrate it?
Well, if you think about it, I think in Christ or Christianity, and I'm not a theologian by any means, the wound is talked about as a living wound. And it's out of that wound that Christ consciousness is born. And you can use other words for it, but it's that place of compassion. We're all wounded. We all are wounded. And working with your own wound really leads you to greater compassion for humanity. And I would say probably most people in the human service field who work in any depth have done a lot of work with their own wounds, and so they can understand and relate. But each person, it's up to you to work with your own healing. You can't heal anybody. We can only heal ourselves. We can support others. And we need to trust they will have their own healing wisdom within, and we support that. Even in analysis and whatnot, finally, the person must heal themselves with the company. It's a lonely journey to do this. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
It does, absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you for your really beautiful words. So I'd like to just take a few minutes together, and Andy's going to play a little piece of music for us. It's Spiegel im Spiegel. Bill Richards' assistant, Mary Cusimano, shared this with us. And just take a moment and digest the experience and look around at the audience. Look at all these beautiful souls. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. That was wonderful. Thank you. And I really, really would appreciate, we would appreciate, so we can bring wonderful speakers in, if you would go to the chat on your way out and click on the donation button and donate whatever you can towards our next speaker, which would be Thomas Moore, because you're the ones who bring these people here. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you, everybody.
You're so welcome.
Wonderful.
Good night.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Penny.
This was such a gift. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Penny.
Heart opening.
Journey. Yes, yes.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you.
Bon voyage, Marta.
Thank you.
Your name up there.
This was beautiful. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Penny.
Yes. Hi, Albert.
Well, we tried a new way to hear you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night. Good night.
This
Thanks
truly
a lot.
will help everybody.
Oh, good.